Hey, what's up? Dave with Brazos Valley Strength. This week was supposed to be the final week of my previous block, the one right before my competition block next month, but I'm not doing that. I'm doing a deload week this week. So I wanted to talk about the decisions that went into me actually doing a deload week, kind of jumping off of the plan of my previous block. A lot of times people in my comments, I'm giving away these free programs, I'm giving away my program, and people notice pretty often that I very rarely have planned deloads in there. So this week was probably the best opportunity I had because it was essentially an unplanned deload. So I wanted to use this as an opportunity to talk about how I program deloads for myself and my clients, and a lot of other concepts around deloading in general that I think we can dive into a little bit here. So there's probably going to be 4 different week structures that we're going to look at, all as the umbrella potentially as deloading. So what I'll do here is just say that deloading is going to be the overall concept, right? The concept here is just going to be reduction of fatigue. I think we can make that pretty simple as our primary goal for a deload week. But then within that, many of the commenters and on my Instagram story or for my post asking for questions pointed out that there's a lot of other ways that people structure these things, right? So there's just the pure deload week, and we'll talk about that. A lot of times I don't actually program deloads for myself and for clients. We use what I generally call intro weeks. A lot of times there's also pivot weeks, and I have a previous video about those when I was working with Mike at Reactive Training Systems, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit here. And then there's taper weeks, right? Taper heading into a competition. So all 4 of those weeks, generally speaking, serve the same purpose, right? Minimize fatigue and get us prepared for a coming block, a coming training cycle. So what I think I want to do here is try to come up with reasons why you might use each of those. And I think we can maybe make this a little bit more simple than what people think that it should be or think that it really is overall. So to start off, I'm not going to talk too much about intra-block fatigue here. I have another video planned where I'm really going to be talking about like progressions within a block and how we should plan those and really what we should be thinking, how much we need to progress on certain days in order to get stronger. And our perception of fatigue is going to be kind of the cornerstone of that video, I think. So for this video, I think we can just accept that fatigue will be present at times at the end of blocks, right? And I don't really know that it's all that important because, or I guess maybe it's not all that important kind of the level of fatigue that somebody has in order to take a deload. And I think that probably brings me into my first point here is that we don't necessarily need to be doing our deloads or having like a structured deload just because there's fatigue present. And so I think that maybe brings up the kind of the style of programming that I'm tending to use these days is that I don't tend to use either a planned deload week or a pivot week super often with the majority of my clients. Most of the time, I'm letting blocks kind of roll from one block into the next one with an intro week at the beginning. So we'll talk about that here. For my definition of an intro week, it is basically a mirror. It's the exact same block structure as what the rest of the block is going to be, but with little reductions in fatigue and intensity. Or not fatigue, I'm sorry, with volume and intensity. So if we're rolling from our previous block into this new block and we're starting with an intro week, that is going to serve 2 purposes. It's going to help us dissipate some of the fatigue from the previous block, but help us kind of get into a groove in the coming block, right? That now we've maybe rotated a few exercises here and there, we're adding in a few new variations, and we're not super skilled at those things yet, right? And we're potentially tired from the previous block. So with this intro week, we're letting ourselves kind of take a step back, mentally get refreshed, and kind of start getting the hang of what we were looking for in this new block. So generally speaking, how I program blocks for people is that the first week will be an intro week, right? Kind of RPE 6 kind of stuff. Usually not huge reductions in volume, a set or two here and there on a lot of the days. Accessories pulled back just a little bit. But that we're trying to keep people in the groove a little bit, right? That we're not trying to let skill go away very much. And so how we normally do it is that 1 week will be very, very easy, RPE 6-ish. The second week of a block generally is going to be kind of the bridge into the real block, where now we're starting to get into some of those like RPE 7s and 8s. And by week 3, 4, beyond, we're really in the groove and we're really trying to push things and trying to challenge some of those new variations that we're doing, and we should be kind of skilled enough to be able to push them hard. So we've given people a few weeks to kind of get reorganized as far as how they feel and ready to really drive hard and push hard into the rest of the block. So that idea, I think, is kind of the opposite in some ways of what a traditional deload week would be. A normal deload week, a lot of times I think the way that people think about it is it's just the same week that you've been doing through the majority of your block, but with things dramatically reduced, right? So if I were to just take a regular block that I've been doing, if I'm bench pressing on day 1 and doing light squats on day 2, I may follow that exact same structure, the same rep scheme, the same set scheme. There may be reductions here and there, and I'll talk about that. But that we're following the same block just with reductions, just to get people feeling fresh again before we jump into the new block. And I think that that's fine. I think that that's potentially a good way to do it. But I think where it's lacking is probably some of the kind of the mental, the psychological benefits that may be lacking if we're just following the same block structure. And that I think is where pivots have a good bit of value. So I'm gonna maybe blend these ideas just a little bit in my explanation, but hopefully make it a little bit more clear. So one of the biggest reasons that I program planned deload weeks for people is less about the fatigue aspect of things and more so the psychological burnout, right? That if a block has gone particularly well or not, right? That let's say we had an amazing block. We pushed into week 5, 6, and we set a bunch of PRs. At that point, people usually are a little tired, right? Like physically for sure, there's gonna be fatigue present. But after this big finish to a block, big emotional finish as well, having a week that's a little bit lighter, a little bit different, can really help kind of get people back into the mode where like, okay, I'm really ready to push hard again. And if we include a pivot week, which I'll give an explanation of that, I think that does a much better job of overcoming some of those like psychological barriers or psychological fatigue that people have before heading to the next block. And if we're just doing a repeat of the stuff that we did in the previous week, right? Like the textbook definitions or the textbook ways that we would reduce fatigue is, generally speaking, we maintain most of our intensity and decrease, I think a lot of times it's like 30 to 70% of the volume, right? Like that's kind of a textbook way to deload. But from my experience, like that sucks, right? Like it's just no fun. If I still do singles at 6, 7, 8 RPE, but I cut out like the majority of my sets and stuff, those weeks are pretty draining for me, right? Like I go into the week thinking that it's supposed to be kind of easy. I'm supposed to be able to take a little bit of a mental step back and kind of have some good feeling training. But instead, we've kept a lot of the stuff that specifically felt bad, right? Like heavy work, and then now I'm not really bringing it in the same way kind of emotionally, and the stuff feels a little bit worse, and I think it can be kind of discouraging for people. So the alternative to that would just be these pivot weeks, which is not my term, right? I got this, Mike Tashir and the Reactive Training Systems guys, I think were the people who really kind of were pioneering in this capacity here, and a lot of other people are still using it. But the concept here is that we should be reducing fatigue, right? Like I said, all of these weeks, the objective is to reduce fatigue to some degree. But that by changing many of the exercises and variations and rep ranges, that you can increase some sensitivity to future training, right? And I don't know that I want to like spend a lot of time diving into that concept because I think it's real, to some degree. but I don't know how important, how practical it really is. Like, I mean, I've done both and, all of these different styles. And I don't know that just anecdotally, I've noticed a huge difference in like training sensitivity in myself and other lifters after doing pivot weeks. So for an example of a pivot week, it may be if we've been doing doubles and triples, we may now be doing some sets of 10 and some tempo work and things like that. Just things that are very, very different, kind of training different energy systems. And I think to me, the value within those weeks lies a whole lot more in the psychological aspect of it, that you're just doing something different, that you can still be training hard, right? Like you can be doing dumbbell split squats for sets of 10 that are like a 9 RPE. And, we're probably violating, I guess, some of those rules of like volume and stuff in some ways, but I'll come back to some of my thoughts there. But that the mental benefits that people have from just doing something different really, really help when they're going into the next block. And now they're a little bit more driven and kind of just motivated to dive into that, heavier competition work that they've been doing. So with the pivot week, we really want to think of it that the goal for sure is that we are trying to dissipate some fatigue. But I would argue that the biggest benefit there is more so kind of the mental aspect of things. Now, with my programming, I kind of program a combination of all of these things. And maybe for some clarity, even for like my clients these days, I don't call them pivot weeks anymore. I think just on paper, it may be more of a combination of like what a pure pivot week would be and maybe like a pure deload week would be kind of on average. There's some individualization within that. But from my experience doing some of the pivot weeks, I found that it was mentally draining at times. Not always, but if I was doing like kind of hard sets of 10 or something on a high bar back squat or something like that, I think at first that concept I think like worked really well for me and that I was really fresh and kind of excited and all that because it was new. But over time it got to where I was dreading that to some degree. And I think maybe that's not necessarily a criticism of the concept, but maybe like an application of the concept. So I tend to use exercises that are, a little bit different. I mentioned dumbbell split squats, things like that don't really have that kind of like high emotional, like need to perform the exercise well, right? Like if you're doing dumbbell split squats, you can kind of go as hard as possible with those. And it's just not all that daunting compared to like a hard set of 6 on tempo high bar squats or something like that. And I think that is one of the biggest areas that we need to just take into account during these weeks, that we are trying to set people up for better training in the coming block. So as the final one, before I get to kind of my thoughts and application of all of these things, is the taper week. So a taper week is specifically heading into some sort of test period, right? Heading into a competition or maybe just a test within the gym, right? That we are using a week. Generally, the structure is going to be pretty close to the remaining from the previous block that we did, but with the objective of making sure that we're maintaining our top end strength, right? So here would be a good area to where some of those rules, as far as like maintaining intensity and dropping volume, have a pretty good carryover, or I think practically make a lot of sense, is that we do want to keep our competition lifts around and we want to maintain our practice on those lifts. And it takes a good bit of trial and error to really find what makes you feel really good on your competition day. So that one I think is kind of not the direct opposite, but conceptually more so the opposite of a deload than people would think. Whereas like a regular deload and even like a pivot week, what I mentioned with those is the potential increase in sensitivity by removing some of the normal training stimulus that we're doing. The cost with that is that potentially we are losing some of our short-term skill with these movements, right? That if I remove my low bar back squat, my sumo deadlift from the lift, the potential risk there is that I go into the first couple weeks of my block and I'm just not really feeling as good, as skilled, as practiced as I possibly can. And I think that like on the surface, that kind of sounds like a risk, but I think that it ends up being maybe outweighed by the physiological engagement that we get from people, right? Like short-term reductions in skill probably don't end up making us, at the end of our following block, what's gonna be the difference, right? Like if I would have maintained a little bit more skill at the beginning, does that make me get stronger at the end of the block? And so that's where we need to think about individualization within this. So from a broad sense, I think that people very much overvalue deload weeks, especially just from the thought, kind of the concept of the reduction in fatigue, right? Because what I mentioned is that we can do a pretty good job of that in our intro weeks, right? If we're reducing a good bit of our training stress during those first couple weeks of a block, I don't think that many people need like a pure week of total fatigue reduction to be able to continue to still have productive training within a block, right? And like I said, I do have a video plan that I think will hopefully help us analyze a little bit more of like feelings of fatigue within a block. So we're gonna come back to that, I guess, in the future. But I think that the biggest benefit is just that kind of freshness mentally, that people will go into their blocks kind of willing and ready to try harder. But we do have to balance how much skill these people need. And I think broadly, a newer lifter, a less experienced lifter, kind of a weaker lifter, probably does not need to have this like pure pivot week to where stuff is really, really changed, right? Like that person is just not going to have kind of as much fatigue overall and probably needs a little bit more skill practice to be able to really be productive through their entire block. Now, the psychological issues within that are still very much true. And I think that what we can do within our weeks is we can tend to split things, right? We can do a couple of days of like light training, right? Like kind of pivot kind of training. And then the back half of the week, make it a little bit more specific, right? Still do some singles and get people a little bit more practiced so that they move into their block kind of ready to go. So all of these things don't really need to be mutually exclusive, right? I think that the concepts can really carry over, from one to another without really assigning like a specific name to it. But the cost, the risk of doing deload weeks, pivot weeks, is always going to be that reduction of skill. So the people in my comments, some of them mentioned like, oh, why do I deload and I feel worse? Well, like you've reduced your skill a lot, and that's okay, right? I think that we don't need to assign value the success of our deload week based on how strong we are immediately after. I think that can tell us some stuff, right? Like if we deload and immediately one of our lifts is like way better, then it may tell us like, okay, maybe we were training a little bit too hard in the previous block. That may be something we want to account for, or that we can just trust when you're fresh, you're gonna do better. Deadlifts seem to be one of the ones that people kind of do the best with, that after a deload week, sometimes people feel really, really good with those, but not always. So anyway, I think that probably should give people a pretty good idea of what we're going for, right? All four of these different concepts are about creating a situation to where with a taper week that you're ready to perform at your highest by reducing some fatigue. The other ones, an intro week, a pivot week, a pure kind of deload week, are all varying degrees of fatigue reduction and varying degrees of addressing kind of the mental, kind of psychological things that go into training. So for me personally, my block was going fine, right? Like I've been bench pressing really well. I've been squatting decent enough, but my deadlifts over the last few weeks have been just a dumpster fire. And I don't really have a reason why. They were actually looking really, really good. They were building well. And then I had like one really bad training session, didn't really think about it. The next week was a lot worse. And I think at that point, I just started thinking about the timing and the process that I wanted to have heading into the corrupted strength meet in a few months, I guess 6-7 weeks at this point. And so for me, I valued a little bit more the kind of the mental break, right? Me just saying like, look, I'm just gonna take a little bit of a step back, right? I'm gonna do a little deload, and then I'll be able to start fresh mentally and not be kind of annoyed at what is going on with my deadlift. Instead of using this last week to try to fix things, I could use the deload week to just kind of mentally reset and then get back at it. So what I've done is I've included a link in the description of this video down below with a bunch of different samples. Hopefully that can help illustrate the point here that I'm making, or kind of the different points. So a few different deload weeks, some higher specificity deload weeks, some lower specificity deload weeks, a pure pivot week in there. I guess the second one that I mentioned is kind of a combination of a pivot and a deload in there, and then a taper week. So what I want with this though is that you can use these to visualize what I'm talking about as far as specificity and kind of training frequency. You should look at them in the context of the programs that you've seen from me, right? Like if you were to take these weeks that are on paper and compare them to the most recent block that I've done, you may be able to see what I mean as far as like changing variables or maintaining certain variables. But there's a lot of stuff that's like blank in there. I don't really have rep ranges, things like that, because I think we do want some flexibility within our program design, and we want to be able to adapt it to the individual. So all the things that I mentioned are really just concepts, and that the main thing that we want to accomplish with deload weeks, pivot weeks, whatever, intro weeks, is that we're trying to set up successful training in coming weeks and be able to go wholeheartedly at it physically, mentally, and really just continue to create good training. So anyway, if that video was helpful, give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you next time.